Preface. Homer and Classical Philology originated as an inaugural lecture delivered in Basel in 1869. It is not, therefore, a treatise composed in the tranquility of the study, but a threshold text, an opening address, a declaration of intent, and an act of responsibility toward a discipline that, despite its considerable cultural prestige, seemed to labor under a persistent unease. Running through these pages is an awareness that philology cannot merely function, nor mechanically repeat its own procedures. It must justify itself, account for itself, and above all, find its bearing. From the outset, the text advances an uncomfortable diagnosis, stated with candor. There is no unified public opinion regarding classical philology, not even among those who practice or defend it. Its character has become manifold, heterogeneous, at times diffuse, and frequently incapable of recognizing itself as a unified conceptual whole. Yet this diversity is not presented here as an accident to be corrected, but as an originary condition, philology as an assemblage of impulses, bodies of knowledge, and aims that coexist without fully merging. To think through this condition, the text ventures a definition as ambitious as it is unsettling for any specialist field. Classical philology is history because it seeks to understand the expressions of peoples and individuals across time. It is natural science because it probes the instinct of language and its laws. And it is aesthetics because it confronts classical antiquity as an ideal that calls the present into question. To this triad is added a decisive trait: its pedagogical vocation, which is no mere ornament but a formative force that shapes the discipline at its very root. These coordinates matter because they set the tone of the book. Here, philology is neither mere textual emendation, nor the simple accumulation of data, nor ornamental erudition. It appears as an intellectual way of life demanding precision and judgment, patience and taste, method and historical sensibility. And because this manifold demand generates inevitable friction between science and art, between critique and veneration, the author chooses an exemplary field in which such tensions become visible, the so-called Homeric question. Around Homer, there unfolds an insight of far-reaching consequence. The dispute is not merely a controversy over attribution, but a laboratory in which the modern way of thinking about the relationship between individual, work, tradition, and people is put to the test. The decisive question is not simply who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, but what author means when what reaches us has passed through centuries of transmission, selection, recomposition, reading, and canonization. At that crossroads, philology learns to distrust quick solutions. The historical survey the text proposes shows how the name Homer expanded and contracted according to the cultural needs and assumptions of different eras. There was a time when a flood tide of epics could be identified with that name. Later, Homer came to encompass a heterogeneous profusion, almost like an empty shell. From this emerges the crux of the problem. Has a concept been made from a person or a person constructed from a concept? Is Homer a creative individual or the emblem that a culture places over a body of works to confer upon them unity, authority, and a face? That question leads to a central thesis. Throughout much of the tradition, Homer functions as an aesthetic judgment rather than a historical datum. To call the poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey Homer is not to establish a biography. It is to express a recognition of excellence, a way of condensing into a single name the epic ideal. This is precisely why the Homeric debate is pivotal for philology. It compels a distinction between what the text is as a transmitted work and what the text means within the cultural history that consecrates it and renders it normative. But the book does not confine itself to dismantling devotions. Its movement is more nuanced, and, for that reason, more unsettling. It diagnoses the modern temptation to set folk poetry against individual poetry, and denounces that opposition as a dangerous fallacy when it is used to explain automatically what is, in reality, a complex mediation. The valorization of the folk spirit may be a fertile discovery, but it becomes distorting when it erases the individual, or when it turns tradition into a blind force that explains everything. The aim is a new rigor. Thinking together, genius, oral transmission, recomposition, and reception. In the closing section, the text returns to its central question: what, in the final analysis, should classical philology be? There, the programmatic formulation appears, an inversion of Seneca: Philosophia facta est quae philologia fuit. The point is not to dissolve philology into philosophy, but to prevent the discipline from collapsing into technique without horizon. Hence, the decisive claim: all philological activity must be bounded and sheltered by a philosophical conception of the world, one in which the merely individual is relativized in the face of a sense of totality and unity. Read today, this book retains a peculiar relevance. Not because the disputes over Homer remain unchanged, but because the underlying problem persists. In an age of hyper-specialization, philology, like every humanistic discipline, runs the risk of becoming a sum of procedures without a guiding question. These pages remind us that method matters, but the hierarchy of questions matters more. What we seek when we seek an author, what we seek when we reconstruct a tradition, what we seek when we call an ancient world classical and bring it into critical dialogue with the present. To enter here is to accept that philology, in every act of reading, puts its relationship with truth, beauty, and meaning at stake. Dr. Jorge F. Vidovich. Beginning of the book. Homer and Classical Philology. Inaugural Lecture. Basel, 1869. Delivered by Friedrich Nietzsche. Undaunted, here I stand in Basel, alone. Let us take our grievance to God. And I cry aloud, Homer, Homer. So each one bears his burden. Go to church, go home, and laugh till the rafters ring. But I no longer trouble myself with that. The finest of audiences hearkens to my Homeric cries, and before them stands patient and still. For praising this comic genius truly, I offer Jeremy humble thanks. Homer and Classical Philology. In our time, there exists no unified and clearly recognizable public opinion regarding classical philology. This can generally be observed both in intellectual circles and among the very practitioners of that discipline. The reason lies in its manifold character, in the lack of conceptual unity, and in the inorganic state of aggregation of different scientific activities united solely by the name philology. It must honestly be acknowledged that philology is, in a sense, composed of several disciplines and resembles a potion blending strange juices, metals, and bones. For it also contains within itself an imperious, single-minded artistic element resting on an aesthetic and ethical foundation, which stands in precarious tension with its purely scientific character. Philology is at once a branch of history, a branch of natural science, and a branch of aesthetics. History insofar as it seeks to comprehend the expressions of particular national individualities in ever-changing forms, and the governing law within the flux of phenomena. Natural science insofar as philology endeavors to probe the deepest instinct of humankind, the instinct of language. And finally, aesthetics, insofar as it singles out so-called classical antiquity from among the range of ancient civilizations, with the aim and intention of excavating a buried ideal world and holding up the mirror of the classical and eternally valid against the present age. The fact that these impulses, so different in their scientific as well as their aesthetic and ethical character, have been grouped under a common name, under a kind of nominal monarchy, is explained by the circumstance that philology has been pedagogical in origin and throughout its entire history. From a pedagogical standpoint, a selection of the most instructive and formative elements was made available, and it was likewise under the pressure of practical necessity, following a professional calling, that this discipline, or at least this scientific tendency, as we philologists designate it, developed. The various so-called fundamental orientations of the discipline have emerged at particular times, with greater or lesser insistence, in connection with the degree of culture and the development of taste characteristic of each respective period. And each of the representatives of this discipline, moreover, tends to regard as the central orientations of philology precisely those most suited to their own capacities and inclinations, so that the public estimation of philology depends to a considerable degree on the standing of individual philological personalities. At present, That is, in an era that has witnessed outstanding figures in nearly every possible direction within philology, a widespread uncertainty of judgment has grown to excess, accompanied by a prevailing indifference to philological problems. This ambiguous and half-formed state of public opinion affects a discipline so sensitive that its declared and concealed enemies can operate with far greater effect. And philology has no small number of such enemies. Among them one finds mockers, ever ready to strike a blow at the philological moles, those who make a profession of raising clouds of dust, turning over for the 11th time clods of earth already turned 10 times before. Yet for this class of adversaries, philology is, after all, merely a harmless pastime, pointless to be sure, but innocuous, an object of ridicule rather than hatred. By contrast, a fierce and implacable hostility toward philology is encountered wherever the ideal as such is feared, wherever modern man falls to his knees before himself in self-satisfied admiration, wherever Hellenic civilization is dismissed as a superseded and therefore irrelevant reference point. Against these enemies, we must count on the support of artists and artistically attuned natures, for only they are capable of understanding these sentiments, just as the sword of the barbarians hangs over the head of all who lose sight of the ineffable simplicity and noble dignity of the Hellenic world. For neither the most dazzling advances in technology and industry, nor the most current school regulations, nor the widespread political education of the masses can preserve us from the curse of absurd and Scythian perversions of taste, or from annihilation at the hands of the terrifyingly beautiful Gorgon's head of the classical. While philology as a whole is viewed with suspicion by both categories of adversaries described above, there exist, on the other hand, numerous and highly varied animosities directed at particular philological orientations, the internecine conflicts that push philologists to the limits of their relations with one another. Controversies of an entirely domestic nature, provoked by feudal disputes over professional rank and mutual jealousy, but above all by the already noted diversity and even antagonism among the fundamental impulses grouped under the name of philology, which have yet to be reconciled into a unity. Philology shares with art the quality of finding the most commonplace things entirely new and arresting, of seeing them, as if by the power of some enchantment, as if newborn and experienced for the very first time. Life is worth living, says art, the most beautiful of all seductresses. Life is worth knowing, says science. From this opposition arises the inner contradiction, so often painfully manifest in the very concept of classical philology and in the practice guided by that concept. If we adopt a strictly scientific stance toward antiquity, we may then attempt to comprehend the past through the historian's eyes, or to catalog the linguistic forms of the masterworks of antiquity, compare them, and at best reduce them to morphological laws in the manner of the natural scientist. Yet we invariably lose what is most wonderfully formative, the genuine fragrance of the ancient atmosphere. We forget that yearning emotion which transported our senses and sensibilities toward the Greeks with the force of instinct, like an enchanting guide. Here, one must take note of a particular hostility, at first glance highly surprising, that philology cannot but continually lament. It comes precisely from those circles on whose support we must most confidently rely. The artistically minded friends of antiquity, the ardent admirers of Hellenic beauty and noble simplicity, among whom discordant notes are frequently sounded, as though philologists themselves were the true adversaries and destroyers of antiquity and its ideals. Schiller reproached philologists for having shattered Homer's crown. Goethe, who had himself at one time been an adherent of Wolffian ideas about Homer, made his dissent known in the following lines. With the sharp wit that is your own, you freed us from all reverence, and we came to understand quite freely that the Iliad was nothing but a patchwork. Let no one take offense at our dissent, for youth has the power to kindle us, and we hold it above all else. And as a whole, we embrace it with joy. For this lack of piety and taste for veneration, one readily assumes that there must be a deeper reason, and many waver over whether philologists generally lack artistic aptitude and sensibility to such a degree as to be incapable of doing justice to the ideal, or whether a spirit of negation, an iconoclastic, destructive tendency, has held sway among them. But if the very friends of antiquity have characterized the overall nature of classical philology, amid such wavering and doubt, as something thoroughly problematic, What credence should then be given to the realist pronouncements and the catchphrases of men of the moment? To respond to the latter here, with reference to the circle of men assembled in this place, might be entirely beside the point, lest I find myself in the position of that sophist who began publicly to praise and defend Hercules in Sparta, only to be interrupted by a voice asking, "But who has spoken ill of him?" On the contrary, I cannot help but reflect that even within this circle, on one side or another, certain of those misgivings resonate. The kind one hears frequently from the lips of nobly disposed and artistically gifted men, and how an honest philologist can scarcely help but feel them most keenly in his most painful moments, during periods of despondency and low spirits. Perhaps no salvation exists for the individual confronted with the division described above. Yet what we affirm and uphold as our standard is the fact that classical philology as a whole has nothing to do with the struggles and tribulations of its individual adherents. The entire collective scientific and artistic movement of these singular centaurs advances with enormous momentum, yet with cyclopean slowness, toward the overcoming of that chasm between the ideal antiquity, which is perhaps the most beautiful flowering of the German longing for the South, and the real antiquity. And in this endeavor, classical philology aspired to nothing less than the ultimate perfection of its own being, a closing and unification of its initially hostile and merely forcibly conjoined fundamental impulses. One may call that goal unattainable and characterize it as a logically incoherent aspiration. Yet the tendency, the movement in that direction, is present. And I would like to attempt by means of a single example to make clear once and for all that the most significant advances in philology never lead away from the ideal antiquity but toward it, and that newer and worthier altars have been erected precisely where one speaks loosely of the overthrow of sanctuaries. Let us therefore examine from this vantage point the so-called Homeric question, the very problem whose most important aspect Schiller described as a cultivated barbarism. The question of Homer's identity as an author is inseparable from this most significant problem. One hears on all sides the insistent claim that the question of Homer's identity is no longer strictly timely and that we have moved well beyond the true Homeric question. One may certainly add that, for a given period, such as our present philological moment, the problem of authorship may recede somewhat from the center of the question at hand. Yet, what is at stake right now is precisely the delicate experiment of constructing the Homeric poems without relying on the concept of individual authorship as the collective work of many. But if the center of a scholarly question rightly lies at the point from which the entire current of new ideas has sprung, that is, the point at which individual scholarly inquiry intersects with the broader life of science and culture, and if that center is accordingly defined in terms of cultural and historical value, then one must continue to regard the question of authorship as the genuinely productive core of the entire cycle of Homeric inquiry. For the modern world, with respect to Homer, has not merely learned, or so I would argue, a grand historical perspective. It has put one to the test for the first time. Without yet disclosing my own view on whether this experiment was, or could have been, successfully conducted on this particular subject, the fact remains that it furnished the first instance of that fruitful perspective being applied. Here one learned to recognize, in apparently stable and fixed figures, the concentrated expression of the life of ancient peoples. Here one recognized for the first time the remarkable capacity of the folk soul to crystallize states of custom and belief into the form of a single personality. Now that historical criticism has established with full methodological confidence its power to dissolve apparently concrete historical personalities, it is legitimate to characterize that first experiment as a significant event in the history of scholarship, quite irrespective of whether, in this particular case, it succeeded. The natural process is that an epoch-making discovery is typically preceded by a series of spectacular portents and singular preparatory observations. The experiment in question likewise has its own compelling prehistory, though one that reaches back across a surprisingly vast expanse of time. Friedrich August Wolff located the question precisely where Greek antiquity had let it fall from its hands, the culminating point reached by the Greeks' historico-literary studies, and thus their very center, the Homeric question, was the age of the great Alexandrian grammarians. The Homeric question had to traverse the long chain of a uniform evolutionary process up to this culminating point, whose final link, and the final one attainable by antiquity as a whole, is represented by the standpoint of those grammarians. They conceived of the Iliad and the Odyssey as the creations of a single Homer. They explained as psychologically possible the fact that works of such varied character could proceed from a single genius, in opposition to the horizons represented by the ultimate skepticism of occasional singular individuals of antiquity, though not of antiquity as such. To account for the differing overall impression of the two epics while still positing a single poet, old age was invoked as an explanatory device, and the poet of the Odyssey was compared to the declining sun. For the divergences in linguistic and ideological expression, there was the eye of that critic of tireless acuity and discernment. Yet at the same time, a history of Homeric poetry and its transmission had been elaborated, according to which it is not to Homer, but to his redactors and singers that these divergences are to be attributed. The tradition of Homer was imagined to have been transmitted orally for a long time, and an improvising and no less forgetful singer had exposed it to the unlettered. At a given moment, during the age of Pisistratus, the fragments that had survived in oral form were said to have been gathered into a written text. Yet the redactors were permitted to take the liberty of removing what was weak and disruptive. This entire hypothesis is the most significant in the field of literary scholarship that antiquity has to offer. Chief among its contributions is the recognition of an oral transmission of Homer, in opposition to the ingrained habits of an age steeped in written texts, a remarkable apex of ancient scholarly rigor. From those times to those of Friedrich August Wolff, one must leap across an immense void. Yet in crossing that boundary, we find scholarship once again at precisely the point where antiquity had gathered the momentum to advance further. And it matters little that Wolff took as established tradition what antiquity itself had posited as hypothesis. As the defining feature of this hypothesis, it may be noted that, strictly speaking, one must have begun in earnest with the figure of Homer as a person, that a certain coherence and internal consistency in the expressions of personality in general must be presupposed, and that two additional ingenious hypotheses are deployed to dismiss as non-Homeric everything that contradicts this coherence. Yet this same fundamental impulse, the desire to recognize a comprehensible personality rather than a supernatural being, runs likewise through all those stages that lead up to that culminating point, and indeed with ever-increasing force and growing, more accessible clarity. The individual is felt and emphasized with ever greater intensity, and the psychological possibility of a single Homer is demanded with increasing vigor. Proceeding gradually backward from that culminating point, we encounter Aristotle's view of the Homeric problem. For Aristotle, Homer represents the immaculate and consummate artist, clearly conscious of his aims and his means. Yet a certain critical immaturity is also evident, manifest in the straightforward deference to popular opinion that attributed to Homer the model of all comic epics as well, the Margits. Moving further back from Aristotle, we find an increasing inability to grasp a coherent personality. The legend surrounding the name of Homer grows ever larger, and each age has its own degree of critical scrutiny regarding how much and what may pass as Homeric. One involuntarily perceives, in this slow backward movement, that there exists a period, prior to Herodotus, in which a considerable high tide of major epics was being identified with the name of Homer. If we transport ourselves to the age of Pisistratus, the word Homer, at that time, encompassed a profusion of the most heterogeneous material. What did Homer signify then? It is clear that that age felt capable of scientifically grasping a personality and the limits of its expressions. Homer had here become almost an empty shell. At this point, the most important question presents itself. What lies before this period? Did the personality of Homer gradually dissolve into an empty name because it could not be comprehended? Or was all heroic poetry at that time personified in a simple popular fashion and accounted for through the figure of Homer? Was a concept derived from a person, or a person constructed from a concept? This is properly the Homeric question, that central problem of personality. The difficulty in answering this question grows even greater if one seeks a response from another vantage point, namely, from the perspective of received history. just as it is difficult today and requires rigorous effort to come to terms with the paradox of the law of gravitation, that the Earth alters its pattern of motion when another celestial body changes its position in space, without any material connection existing between the two, so too does it now require effort to arrive at a full appreciation of that remarkable problem which, having passed from hand to hand, has progressively lost its originally striking character. There exist poetic works before which the mind bows in emulation of the greatest geniuses, works that have furnished models for every artistic period and have never been surpassed. And yet the poet who composed them is an empty, elusive name, one in which no firm core of a powerful personality can in any way be discerned. For who dared to contend with the gods, to strive with the One, said Goethe himself, who as much as any other genius wrestled with that mysterious problem of Homer's unattainability. Precisely to bridge this gap, the concept of folk poetry emerged. A deeper and more primordial force than that of any individual creator must have been at work here. The most fortunate of peoples in its most fortunate age, at the height of its imaginative power and creative poetic energy, must have produced those immeasurable poems. Taken in its broadest sense, the idea of folk composition has something intoxicating about it. One feels the vast and overwhelming unleashing of a collective endowment together with its artistic delight, and rejoices in this natural phenomenon as one delights in an untamable and torrential rush of water. But as soon as one wished to approach this idea and look it squarely in the face, an anonymous mass of folk poets was unwittingly substituted for the composing soul of the people. A long succession of popular singers in whom the individual counted for nothing, but in whom a surge of the people's soul, the intuitive power of the people's eye, an undiminished fullness of popular imagination, asserted itself. A series of indigenous geniuses belonging to one era, one poetic genre, one subject matter. Yet such a conception rightly invited suspicion. Nature, which surrounds genius with such extreme rarity and economy, as its most costly and exceptional product, could it really have been prodigal, with inexplicable caprice, at precisely one single point? Here the disquieting question resurfaced. Is even a single genius insufficient to account for the enduring existence of that unreachable excellence? The gaze now sharpened to discern where exactly that excellence and singularity might be located. It cannot be found in the overall structure of the complete works, argued one faction, for that structure is thoroughly defective. It can be found, rather, in individual passages, generally in the particular rather than in the whole. A rival faction, by contrast, invoked the authority of Aristotle, who admired what he called the divine quality of Homer, above all in the design and selection of the whole. If that design did not appear so cleanly finished, this would be a deficiency to be attributed to the tradition rather than to the poet. The consequence of later additions and interpolations through which the original core had gradually become obscured. The more the first tendency sought out inconsistencies, contradictions, and discrepancies, the more resolutely the other set aside everything that, in its estimation, obscured the original plan, in order to recover, as far as possible, the primary epic in its interrupted form. The second tendency consisted essentially in adhering to the concept of an epoch-making genius as the founder of the greatest artistic epics. The other tendency, by contrast, vacillated between positing a single genius alongside a number of lesser secondary poets, and a further hypothesis that generally required no more than a succession of individually skilled though mediocre singers, presupposing a mysterious, continuous current and a deep popular artistic impulse that manifests itself through the individual singer as through an almost indifferent medium. It is from this latter tendency that the incomparable distinctive qualities of the Homeric poems come to be presented as the expression of that mysteriously growing impulse. All these tendencies proceed from the assumption that the problem of the endurance of those epics must be resolved from the standpoint of aesthetic judgment. The solution is expected to emerge from correctly drawing the dividing line between the individual genius and the poetic soul of the people. Are there then characteristic differences between the manifestations of the individual genius and those of the poetic soul of the people? This total confrontation is unjustified and leads to error. This brings us to the following consideration. In modern aesthetics, no opposition is more dangerous than that between folk poetry and individual poetry, or, as it is commonly called, artistic poetry. This is the backlash, or, if one prefers, the superstition that accompanied the discovery of historico-philological science, with its richest consequences, the discovery and dignification of the popular soul. For with it, the ground had been prepared for a treatment approaching the scientific study of history, which until then, and in many respects until now, had been a mere collection of materials, with the intent that these materials accumulate indefinitely, without ever succeeding in uncovering the law and pattern underlying this eternally renewed breaking of the waves. Now, for the first time, the long-felt power of the greatest individualities and of the phenomena of the will was understood insofar as it represents the smallest minimum of the individual human being. It was recognized how everything that truly pertains to greatness and breadth in the realm of the will cannot have its roots penetrating to the very deepest levels in the ephemeral and powerless individual figure. It became possible at last to conceive of the great instincts of the masses, the unconscious drives of peoples, as the true bearers and levers of what is called universal history. But the flame that cast new light also cast its shadow, and this shadow is precisely the superstition mentioned above, which set folk poetry against individual poetry, and furthermore extended in a suspicious manner the vaguely understood concept of the soul of the people to that of the spirit of the people. Through the misuse of a compellingly seductive argument by analogy, this framework had made its way into the realm of the intellect and of artistic ideas, deploying the proposition of the greater individuality, which holds validity solely in the realm of the will, where it did not belong. Never has the crowd, so disagreeable and unphilosophical, been more flatteringly courted than here, where the crown of genius was placed upon its bald head. One imagined, more or less, that just as new layers of bark form around a core, those mass poems arose the way avalanches form, that is, by following the current in the flow of tradition. Yet there was little inclination to acknowledge even the smallest possible nucleus, so that it might on occasion be inferred without any appreciable loss to the total mass. For this view, then, tradition and what has been transmitted are one and the same thing. In reality, however, no such opposition exists between folk poetry and individual poetry. Rather, all poetry, folk poetry included, naturally, requires an individual as its mediator. This confrontation, in its most abusive form, makes sense only when individual poetry is understood as that which has not grown on the soil of popular feeling, but rather traces back to an unpopular creator working in an unpopular environment, one who would have been more at home, in a manner of speaking, in the scholar's study. Linked to the superstition positing a poetizing mass is another, namely that folk poetry is confined to a particular period in the life of each people, after which it dies out, as indeed follows from that first superstition. In place of this gradually fading folk poetry, artistic poetry is said to emerge, according to this view, the work of singular minds rather than of a collective mass. But the same forces that once were at work continue to operate today, and the manner in which they operate has remained precisely the same. The great poet of a literary age remains a poet of the people no less than an ancient folk poet of a pre-literate period. The only difference between the two concerns something entirely distinct from the manner in which their poems originate, namely, dissemination and reach, in short, tradition. For tradition, without the support of the written word, is cast into the eternal current and exposed to the risk of absorbing foreign elements, remnants of those individualities through whom the path of tradition passes. If we apply all these propositions to the Homeric poems, we find that the theory of a poetizing popular soul yields nothing, and that under all circumstances we are referred back to the poetic individual. The task thus arises of grasping what is individual and of clearly distinguishing it from what has been carried along in some fashion by the current of oral tradition, something that represents, as it were, the most considerably valuable element of the Homeric poems. Literary history has since ceased to be a registry, or to be capable of serving as one. Let us attempt to identify and articulate the individualities of poets. The method entails a certain mechanism. It must be clarified and consequently derived from first principles why this or that individuality manifests itself in one way rather than another. Biographical data, surroundings, relationships, and the defining events of an era are then marshaled, and one believes the desired individuality has been constructed by combining these ingredients. What is unfortunately forgotten is that precisely the driving point, the indefinable individual element, cannot emerge as a result. The less that is known about the period and the life, the less this mechanism can be applied. But when one has only the works and the name, the case is already poor for establishing individuality, at least for those partial to the mechanism described, and particularly poor when the works are perfectly suited to serve as folk poems. For what these mechanicians can still first grasp of the individual lies in the divergences from the popular genius, in the distortions and in the concealed lines. Consequently, the fewer distortions a work of poetry contains, the more indistinct the distinguishing characteristics of the individual poet become. All such distortions, all that is loose and excessive which one believes to find in the Homeric poems, one was immediately inclined to attribute to the damned tradition. What then remained as the individually Homeric? Nothing more than a select series of especially beautiful and outstanding passages, identified according to the subjective inclinations of taste. The personification of aesthetic singularity that the individual recognized in accordance with his own artistic sensibility, he called Homer. This is the central point of the Homeric errors. For the name Homer, from the outset, bears no necessary relation to the concept of aesthetic perfection, nor to the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer, as the poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey, is not a Homeric tradition, but an aesthetic judgment. The only path that leads us to the time of Pisistratus and carries us forward beyond the significance of Homer's name passes on one side through numerous Homeric citizens, from whom it becomes unambiguous how epic Homeric poems and Homer have been identified everywhere as one, while he appears nowhere, in any other sense, as more than the poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and no more so than of the Thebaid or any other cyclic epic. On the other hand, the most ancient legend speaks of a rivalry between Homer and Hesiod, so that two epic directions were implied in the mention of these names, the heroic and the didactic, and consequently the significance of Homer was placed in subject matter rather than in form. That fabricated rivalry with Hesiod likewise shows scarcely even a dim presentiment of individual authorship. But from the time of Pisistratus onward, through the surprisingly rapid development of aesthetic sensibility among the Greeks, the evaluative aesthetic differences between those epics were perceived with ever-increasing clarity. The Iliad and the Odyssey rose above the current and have remained at the surface ever since. Through this process of aesthetic selection, the concept of Homer grew progressively narrower. The ancient material significance of Homer, the father of heroic epic poetry, gave way to the aesthetic significance of Homer, the father of poetry in general, and at the same time its unreachable archetype. This remodeling was accompanied by a rationalist critique which set about making of Homer the admirable man, a plausible poet, one that asserted the material and formal contradictions of those numerous epics against the unity of a single poet and gradually lifted the heavy burden of the cyclic epics from Homer's shoulders. Homer, as the poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey, is therefore an aesthetic judgment. This by no means implies, however, that the poet of those epics is himself a mere fiction, indeed an aesthetic impossibility, which will be the view of a small number of philologists. The majority holds rather that the overall design of a poem such as the Iliad is properly the work of an individual, and that this individual is Homer. The former point must be conceded, but I am compelled to deny the latter for the reasons stated. I also doubt whether the majority has arrived at recognition of the first point through the following consideration. The plan of an epic such as the Iliad is not a whole, not an organism, but a stringing together, a product of reflection proceeding according to aesthetic rules. The measure of an artist's greatness is certainly determined by the degree to which he can encompass such a work immediately in a single unifying vision and develop it rhythmically. The immense wealth of images and scenes in a Homeric epic renders such an overview almost impossible. But where an artistic overview is not attainable, the customary recourse is to string concepts upon concepts and to conceive of an order by following a conceptual schema. This will produce effects all the more perfectly, the more consciously the organizing artist employs the fundamental aesthetic laws. The illusion may even arise that he conceived the whole, in a single vigorous instant, as an intuitive totality. The Iliad is not a wreath but a garland of flowers. The greatest possible number of images has been introduced into a single frame, yet the compiler gave no thought to whether the arrangement of the assembled images was also pleasing and rhythmically beautiful, for he knew that the whole would be of no concern to anyone, only the individual parts. That stringing together may have existed as the expression of an artistic understanding still poorly developed, even less comprehended, and generally less appreciated. Yet it cannot have been the properly Homeric achievement, the epoch-making event. The plan, rather, is precisely the last product, and considerably later than Homer's renown. Those, then, who seek the most original and perfect plan are chasing a phantom. For the hazardous course of oral tradition had run its length by the time any regularity of design arrived, and the distortions that course had entailed may well not have affected a plan that was not yet fully contained within the transmitted body of material. Yet the relative imperfection of the plan cannot in any way be invoked to assign to its architect a personality distinct from that of the true poet. Not only is it plausible that everything created in those times with consciously aesthetic intention fell infinitely short when compared to songs that welled up with instinctive force. One can go a step further. If the so-called major cyclic poems are compared with one another, then the undeniable credit that belongs to whoever designed the Iliad and the Odyssey is to have achieved the relatively highest performance in this conscious technique of composition, a credit we might well be prepared to grant in advance to whoever, in our estimation, stands first in the realm of instinctive creation. Perhaps some will even welcome certain far-reaching indications within this connection. All those features commonly regarded as significant weaknesses and flaws, yet viewed in a highly subjective manner in their totality, features we are accustomed to seeing as the fossilized residues of periods of transmission, are they not perhaps merely the near-inevitable defects to which the ingenious poet, with his grandly intentioned, nearly modelless, and incalculably difficult act of composition, was bound to fall heir? It should be noted that the penetration, in very different ways, into the workshops of the instinctive and the conscious, in ways entirely different from one another, shifts the framing of the Homeric problem, and in my view, toward the light. We believe in the single great poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but not in Homer as that poet. On this point, the resolution has already been given. That age which invented the innumerable legends of Homer, which composed the myth of the rivalry between the Homeric and the Hesiodic, which regarded all the poems of the cycle as Homeric, did not sense an aesthetic singularity but a material one when it pronounced the name Homer. Homer, for that age, belongs to the series of artistic names such as Orpheus, Eumolpus, Daedalus, Olympus, the series of the mythical discoverers of a new artistic branch, to whom all subsequent fruits growing from that new branch are likewise to be attributed. And that most admirable genius to whom we owe the Iliad and the Odyssey belongs, to be sure, to this grateful posterity as well. He too sacrificed his name upon the altar of Homer, the most ancient father of heroic epic poetry. Up to this point, and with strict detachment from all particularities, most esteemed listeners, I have sought to lay before you the fundamental philosophical and aesthetic features of the Homeric problem of authorship, on the assumption that the basic formations of that many-ridged and deeply fissured mountain range, known as the Homeric question, can be brought into view with the greatest possible precision and clarity, from the widest remove and from the heights. At the same time, I can imagine those friends of antiquity who are so fond of charging us philologists with a lack of reverence for great ideas and a sterile delight in destruction, and who will have called to mind two facts by way of example. First, there were those great concepts, such as, for instance, the notions surrounding Homer as a single, untouchable, and undivided genius, which in the pre-Wolfian period were in fact simply too large and therefore inwardly hollow and brittle when grasped crudely. If classical philology now returns to those same concepts, only the old wineskins remain visible. In truth, everything has been made new. Wineskin and spirit, wine and word. One can trace everywhere that philologists have lived for nearly a century, in the company of poets, thinkers, and artists. it follows that the heap of ash and slag that once characterized classical antiquity has been transformed into a rich and abundantly fertile field of cultivation. And secondly, I would like to address once more those friends of antiquity who turn away from classical philology in dissatisfaction. You certainly venerate the immortal masterworks of the Hellenic spirit in text and image, and you consider yourselves richer and more fortunate than any previous generation that had to do without them. But do not forget that this enchanting world was once buried, covered beneath prejudices as high as mountains. Do not forget that the blood, the sweat, and the most arduous intellectual labor of countless devotees of our discipline were required to bring that world back from its submersion. Philology is by no means the creator of that world, nor is it the performer of this immortal music. But should it not be regarded as a service, and indeed a great service, merely to have had the skill to make that music resound once more for the first time, lying as it had for so long in a dark corner, undeciphered and unappreciated? What was Homer before this bold intellectual achievement of Wolfe? A respectable ancient, known at best under the designation of natural genius, and in any case the son of a barbarous age, riddled with faults against good taste and good manners. Let us hear, moreover, how as late as 1783 an eminent scholar could write about Homer. But where is this good fellow to be found? Why has he remained unknown for so long? Sick? Apropos, could someone not obtain a silhouette of him? We ask for gratitude, not on our own behalf by any means, for we are but atoms, but on behalf of philology itself, which is certainly neither a muse nor a grace, but a messenger of the gods. And as the muses descend to the sorrowful and tormented peasant, so philology comes to a world filled with dark colors and shadowy images, filled with the most acute and incurable suffering, and tells us, for our consolation, of the beautiful and luminous divine figures of an enchanted land, distant, blue, and blessed. So much for that. And yet a few more words must be said, of the most personal kind. But the occasion for this address will justify them. It is fitting for a philologist as well to capture the goal of his endeavors and the path toward it in the brief formula of a credo. And let this be accomplished here, inasmuch as I invert a phrase of Seneca, Philosophia facta est quae philologia fuit. By this it should be made plain that all and every philological activity must be enclosed and sheltered within a philosophical worldview, in which everything individual and particularized is dissolved as though into vapor, and only the whole and the unitary endures. And so allow me to express my hope that in this orientation I shall not be a stranger among you. Grant me your confidence that, working alongside you in this direction, I shall also be in a position to prove worthy, in a special way, of the remarkable trust that the high authorities of this community have placed in me. End.